Well, welcome to another Portland at the Movies. My name is Todd Werkhoven, and with me, as always, is Mark Middleton. How are you, Mark?
I'm really well.
Good, and we're joined, as always, by Brian, the Unipiper kid. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing really well, Todd.
Great. We have a very special guest today, Mr. Dan, and I'm going to claim ignorance because I still don't know quite how your last name is pronounced.
Fiebiger.
Fiebiger. Well, Dan Fiebiger, the musician behind the movie Courier of Death and many other Portland movie stories. I listened back to the episode that we did a while back in Courier of Death, and it seems like every time we research a movie, we two different people come up. One of them is David Walker, and one of them is Tom Shaw and you. And so to finally have you come in studio to talk about one of the best, I think still my favorite movie that we've done on this show.
Hands down.
Courier of Death. So welcome to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
So we actually spoke with you a couple days ago, last Wednesday, and you were telling us the stories and all of your experiences, and it was quite amazing. So can you kind of let us know kind of a quick background of how you came to be in the Portland movie scene, in the music aspect of the Portland scene, from where you were down in California?
Well, I'll go back a little further than that. I spent my first 8 years in Spokane, Washington. My dad was the manager of an indoor theater and a drive-in theater, so I literally grew up watching movies.
Oh, wow.
And we had plenty of radios, and so I literally grew up as rock and roll, as rhythm and blues evolved into rock and roll. Up there was a rhythm and blues station that played a lot of black music in Canada, and we could get it down in Spokane. And so I heard a lot of that music, and that became real ingrained in me. And I was into playing drums at a really early age. I used to play tin cans and Quaker Oats boxes, and I had a bicycle basket with a bunch of loose hoops, and I would, loose spokes, and I'd hit it, and it sounded kind of like a cymbal, in a sandbox. And my folks started buying me toy drum sets that would break instantly because they weren't real drum heads. And so I was kind of musically inclined, at least on drums, right from the beginning. In January 1960, we moved to Portland because my dad got a job that paid about 5 times more as a milk driver at the Carnation Milk Company, delivering milk and dairy products. And so spent the rest of my life in Portland except for 1 year in 1983 when I lived down in the L.A. area. And I started taking formal music lessons at the grade school in Portland that I went to, a Catholic grade school called Holy Redeemer, right near the house that we lived in and that I still live in. I moved back in later on. And I took piano lessons, and for a little while I took cello lessons. And then they recommended that my folks started buying me a snare drum, and then I had to do my own work and save up and buy a cymbal and a hi-hat and eventually piece together a drum set. And by the time I got to high school, I had a whole drum set. And I won a talent contest at North Catholic High School at the tail end of my sophomore year. And so I became known for drumming and music. I also took music lessons, drumming lessons. I learned all the basic 26 military rudiments, and so that made my drumming really precise when I played rock or rhythm and blues or any other genre. I was also in the Portland Junior Symphony for 6 years. And we toured Europe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So then when you went down to California, as you'll tell us, you didn't go down there for music, or what you ended up doing down there didn't involve music, or did it? How did you get down to Southern California?
Yeah, not so much music, but film. I didn't limit myself just to music because of all this film influence I had when I was growing up. I was just as interested in the film industry, how films were made, and I even made an hour-long movie of my childhood, how growing up watching the films of Ray Harryhausen and George Pal, and how they influenced me and affected me. And so I really got into that kind of animation, then other kinds of animation and special effects and visual effects. So and so I learned how to do a lot of that stuff, self-taught on kind of an amateur level. 1967, I got a hold of a little 8mm camera and started making my little weird animated films and visual effects films, and just learning how to do it by just doing it. And I still have those, and someday I'll find a way to get those restored so that they can be seen by somebody. And So I was much into the film industry and visual effects and animation as I was music. And to keep myself from getting bored, I would go back and forth between the two, you know. And so I had these four loves going on at the same time. And there was an old special effects guy named Linwood G. Dunn, whose career went all the way back to the silent film era. And he was the effects guy, visual effects guy for RKO Pictures. And these are the people who made King Kong, the original King Kong, and Citizen Kane with Orson Welles, and a lot of other great famous movies. And he invented the optical printer and refined it and won a bunch of technical Oscars and stuff for it. And he became a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and the American Cinematographers. And he just knew everybody in the industry. He knew Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Orson Welles and Howard Hughes and Lucy and Desi when, you know, RKO was sold to Howard Hughes, and then he sold it to Lucy and Desi. And so Lynn just stayed with him, and so he got to know all these people. And he came up to the University of Oregon in 1975, and I and an animator friend roommate went down there to see him and watch his show, and we had started working on a little animated effects film called Eon. And we'd shot the live action sections, and now we were working on the visual effects parts. And we took what we had that we had pieced together down and showed it to him, and he was pretty impressed. And he said, well, if you guys want to pull up stakes and come down to L.A., there's a new effects studio down there being set up. But neither one of us even had a car. And so getting down to L.A. and living there and just starting all over from scratch, it wasn't too feasible for us. And I later learned on that was ILM, and we turned down a chance to work on the original Star Wars. But you don't find that out till later on. You know?
Like the guy who sold his Apple stock for $10,000 that one time.
Yeah. But I kept in touch with Lynn Dunn, and we sent letters back and forth, and he gave me a free subscription to American Cinematographer, and I wound up writing articles for him. And I wrote articles for another film magazine, a fanzine called Cine Fantastique. So you know, I learned more about filmmaking from reading these magazines cover to cover, and then writing articles and finding these people, the real people who worked on these films that I admired, and interviewing them over the phone and stuff like that. So it was all a giant learning experience. And I took film classes at PSU. This is before the Northwest Film and Video Center really set up their formal film classes. So
was there any sort of film program at PSU at the time?
Kind of a real small one. It was called the Center for the Moving Image. And there was only two teachers. There was Fritz Lang's assistant director.
Wow.
Jeez Louise.
Named Andreas Dynam.
Huh.
Okay.
It's a great name.
And he spoke in a German accent, you know, and he had all these stories about, Metropolis and the Fritz Lang movies. And he moved to Hollywood when Fritz Lang did, and so he continued to work on his films there. And so he taught scripting classes. But he'd never written a script, you know. And then there was Tom Taylor, who was real into making documentary films, and both of them were very anti-Hollywood, and they were very independent, and you know, just get away from the Hollywood scene. And so they didn't really teach anything about the Hollywood system. And but they had equipment, and they had little cameras, 8 millimeters and 16 millimeters, and so taking their classes gave you access to this equipment, so you could go out and make your little films. And a lot of talented filmmakers and untalented ones made films, you know, learned as they went. And that was the whole nature of the class. And those classes started up formally just as I was starting college at PSU in 1970. And they became actual sequences that you could get credit for in 1973, the fall of 73. So I took that sequence during my senior year. And Andreas Dynam, a couple weeks into it, had a stroke. And so he was gone until the following spring when he had fully recovered. And when he was there, he mostly just told stories about Fritz Lang. And so we didn't really learn anything from him, except we heard these really cool stories. So, but, you know, way back then, unbeknownst to me, there was a nice editing system there, 60 millimeter editing system there. And I made a little short film about a projectionist running a Buster Keaton film about a projectionist and enjoying the film he's running in parallel to the audience enjoying the film he's running. And it was kind of a synergy relationship going on between the two that I was trying to establish. And it was called Changeover. And the requirement was it had to be educational. So it was educational about how to do changeovers from one projector to another in the middle of a movie. Those little cues in the upper right-hand corner, those little circles.
Yeah.
And so it told all about that. And so I made that film on that editing system. Then years later, when I work on Courier, there's that exact same editing system. And I realized Tom Shaw had loaned that editing system to the Center for the Moving Image.
To PSU.
Yeah, to PSU. And so, so there's even they were connected with Tom Shaw.
Cool. So if you could give like the thumbnail of who Tom Shaw is to our listeners that might not be familiar.
Well, from what I've been able to gather from my research, he was born in Rhode Island, and he got good at carpentry and machining, metal machining, and putting countertops, high-quality countertops and marble countertops and other materials that countertops are made with. And so he got good at carpentry, wood, machining, that kind of thing. I guess he lived in Florida for a while, was building boats or doing something on boats. And eventually came to Portland, and he had an opportunity to go into a partnership with another guy named Dan Cosette to own most of the porno shops in Portland. And back in the late 60s and early 70s, the porno shops were like, a really big deal. They were all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
They were all painted yellow, and they all made huge amounts of money. And so he owned most of those. And I guess Tom invented the little machines where you put a quarter in, you get to see a little bit of a porno movie. Then if you want to keep seeing it, you put another quarter in. And quarter after quarter after quarter, they made hundreds of thousands of dollars off these
Genius.
things. Yeah, And he was still making money off these porno films when I went to work for him on Courier in 1984, early 1984. And at first I didn't know he owned these porno shops, but I'd signed a contract with him to work on it and do the music, and
what was his
I was kind of
interest?
locked into it. And then I found out about all this underworld stuff he's into.
What was Tom's interest in film? Why did he want to make a film?
I guess that was like a hobby of his or something. He always wanted to get into it, and he made good money off the other jobs he was doing. And so when he had enough money, he bought an Eclair NPR camera, which is the exact same kind of 16-millimeter camera. Cameramen shot movies like Woodstock and Gimme Shelter and all kinds of documentary films, the Monterey Pop Festival. That was like the documentary camera to have. It was made in France. And it's a synchronous camera that's designed to work with a special tape recorder called a Nagra. And both the camera and the Nagra have this crystal sync mechanism that makes them run exactly the speed that they record at. And they exactly match each other, so that the soundtrack on one piece of film covered with iron oxide, like recording tape, and the visual part of film would always synchronize up once you found the key frame. That's why people had a clapboard.
Yep.
All they had to do was find that one frame, and then everything else would be in sync, except on Courier.
So there were some audio issues with Courier, are you saying? Are you suggesting?
Yeah. I'm not suggesting it. I'm just flat out telling you. I'm revealing all this, this hidden stuff.
And we will get to Courier because that's what I really want to. So how did Tom Shaw find you? How did you find each other? And it sounds like you were working on the making of the film and didn't just do the music afterwards. So how did you connect with Tom Shaw?
Yeah, there was maybe a core crew of maybe about 5 or 6 or 7 people, and none of this was a union shoot where you just did your own craft.
Right.
Everybody did everything. The film had 2 cinematographers, and they both appeared in the film. And one of the cinematographers, John Henry Schmier, is the main bad guy behind all the bad things that happen in the film. His name is Bigelow in the film.
Yeah.
And he's this real hammy actor, but he's very good. And he also had cinematography skills. And I met him as a projectionist at a local theater near where I used to live when I was a kid. He was a projectionist there, kind of like Cinema Paradiso.
Yeah.
For real. So I knew him for just decades. And then we wound up working on Courier together. Backtracking a little bit, so Tom Shaw moved to Portland, and he bought this little corner grocery store on the corner of 75th and Division, 7500 Southeast Division. And he boarded up all the windows and remodeled it inside and out and turned it into a little miniature movie studio. And he had this one big room that was the movie studio, and he had a secret door that would come up off the floor in a basement where he stored all his, I guess, sex toys and tapes that he sold, but he also stored all his films and stuff down there, too.
Right.
And I guess the first thing he tried to do was shoot some porno films of his own and direct, and he didn't know how to direct. Plus, he was just a continuous alcoholic, drinking vodka sevens and beer all
Recipe
day.
for success.
Yeah. There was never a time when he wasn't drinking one or the other or both, except when he was sleeping. And if he could have rigged up something to drink it then, he would have. And so his judgment was pretty impaired, and he was inebriated all the time. And so those little porno films he shot, I don't know whether he's trying to make a whole movie or just shorts or what, but I saw them once, and they were pretty disjointed, and the editing was just a mess. And it's like they didn't even work as porno films. And so,
You had one job.
You had one job.
How bad do you have to be to not be able to make a porno film? Just hold the camera still.
So did he, as he's assembling his teams to do, because he did try to make a couple other movies that he didn't finish, how did he get people to work with him if people kind of knew that he wasn't maybe going to pay them or not drunk or whatever?
Word got out to all the film schools, probably the one I went to and the Northwest Film and Video Center, that he had this little miniature movie studio. And if you wanted to come use some 16 millimeter, pretty high quality 16 millimeter equipment and learn how to make a movie and have hands-on experience for free, you didn't have to pay any money for these classes. You'd be making a film for him for free, and it seemed like a nice, win-win barter deal. And so after he gave up on the porno film, some of which he tried to shoot in his backyard, his neighbors complained. I've got an interview with an old lady who was one of the neighbors who was complaining, and she called the cops, and she tells me that story. A friend of mine named Jim Lowry, who knew Tom Shaw, interviewed her and filmed that one. So he gave up on the porno film. So we started hiring people, hiring in quotes, to make a little short film called Brats on the Mountain. This lasts about 20 minutes or so. And it's about two bad guys who kidnap these kids, and they hole them up in some little log cabin in the woods somewhere. And the kids wind up being so obnoxious that the thugs just, please go, just go away, get out of here. And it was kind of like that Home Alone movie, except it was made long before.
I was going to say
Alone
that's
movie.
precursor.
Yeah, exactly. So
now we know where Christopher Columbus and John Hughes get their ideas from.
Adrian, oh God, who was that guy with the big nose who kissed Halle Berry at the Oscars?
Adrian Brody.
Yeah, Brody. He was going to make a remake of Courier for a while.
Really? Knowingly, or like he knows of this movie?
Well, I read in the trades that the L.A. Hollywood trades that this movie called The Courier was in development or something like that, early production or something like that. I sent an email to him and say, "Oh, you might want to see this movie of Courier. That sounds real similar to yours."
Right.
And then suddenly it wasn't
Suddenly
on
it's not
anymore.
there
It's
anymore.
like, oh, maybe they were worried about getting sued. I wasn't going to sue anybody. I just thought it'd be fun. I thought maybe they could release the earlier version of Courier along with their version.
Double feature.
Yeah, so...
the Couriers.
The Couriers.
Yeah, and the film was originally entitled just Courier. The of death was added by the distributor.
Makes sense. I could see why.
It's
great.
Yeah, that Tom Shaw signed a deal.
That's a great punch up.
Yeah.
That's a Patton Oswalt punch up right there.
Yeah. Patton Oswalt. I love him. He was great on that Reno 911 series. I love that.
So it sounds like
so he actually got that film finished.
Okay.
And the guy who did the documentary called Remembering Tom Shaw years later worked on that Brats on the Mountain.
Okay.
And then Tom decided, he's ready to make a feature-length film, and it was going to be a comedy. So we got a lot of local actors, and some of the actors got paid because they weren't, interested in making the film. They appeared in it.
Right.
And by the way, all his films have something to do with a kidnapping. I noticed that pattern, and except the pornos. And
maybe even then.
Yeah, so he's obsessed with kidnaps, I guess. So it was called The Great Oregon Kidnap Caper, and A lot of the film was shot. Maybe all of the film was shot as far as he was concerned. It was done as far as he was concerned. But the script was a little convoluted. Dan Yost wrote the script, and I have a copy of it, and it was a comprehensible story. But by the time the film got made, so much of it had been jumbled up that the story was totally incomprehensible. You had no idea how one scene related to the next, and it had kind of a light comedy tone to the whole thing. And there was some kind of fun visual stuff happening in it, but it just didn't have a story that made any sense. And it had no post-production. There was no music soundtrack. There was no dubbing. There was no EDR, dialogue replacement.
Was it ever released?
Well, he was going to, but I guess... and he brought Monty Python's editor, who had edited the TV series, all the way over from England.
That's a connection, because we mentioned that in our episode, and I kind of forgotten about that. Now, how did that connection happen?
Well, I don't know, because I didn't work on Kidnap Caper.
Okay.
I learned.
So that was not for Courier of Death. That was for Kidnap Caper.
This was all for Kidnap Caper,
Okay.
and I learned all this later when I chanced upon people who had worked on Kidnap Caper, like a local filmmaker, Don Dapp, and a couple local actors and some other local people who had worked on that. Plus, there was a big article in Willamette Week, a big cover story about that movie, like it was about to be finished and it's going to appear in theaters and stuff. And there were 7 articles written about Tom Shaw over the decades, and I happen to have all 7 of them.
Is that the documentary that we ended up watching on the internet way back?
Remembering
Tom
Shaw.
Is there any other copies of that anywhere? I'd love to get that on YouTube, because the way it's almost impossible to find, and it only exists as that tiny Real Player window thing that's terrible.
I have a copy of it on DVD.
Oh.
And just today, I emailed the guy who made it. I'm talking with him.
Nice.
I'll give you his email address, and you can talk to him.
Yeah, I would love to get that so people can see it, because it's great.
Yeah, and he might still have some copies. If he doesn't, with his okay, I can make you a copy.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, no, that would be great.
And we'll probably, get his okay to post it properly on
Right.
YouTube. And
Yeah, and credited. But that was a great little documentary.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it sounds like then Tom accumulated this nice equipment, and the film community just kind of came to him to use it. Like, what other? I know there's some other notable films that maybe use Tom's equipment.
Well, yeah, that's another thing that attracted people, is Tom was willing to loan out his equipment to other people so they could make their short films, and later loaned his equipment out to people for extended periods of time so they could make feature-length movies.
Yeah, well, Fatal Revenge was made using Tom Shaw's equipment.
Yep, another local action movie that was a clone of Courier was shot by Jim Lowry and Phil Roth, who later became pretty famous as a director on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Yep.
Yeah.
And is still making movies in Romania, of all places
like
now.
he makes like 10 movies a year.
Yeah.
Speaking of pornography, his output may as well be with that much.
Yeah. He's a pretty basic filmmaker, shall we say.
Yeah.
And
makes the money.
yeah, it works.
Yeah.
You know, he's found his market niche, and it works for him. So there you go.
So what was the rip-off?
The clone movie was called Bad Trip. I believe
Okay,
it
yeah,
was.
that is on our list.
Yeah, and that was made by a company called Motion Pictures International, and local filmmaker Jim Lowry, who still lives in Portland, and Phil set up this little company to make this film, borrowed Tom's equipment and made it, and then made their own distribution deal, basically following in Tom's footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
And they were going to make another movie. I think they were going to be involved in Fatal Revenge, but then they didn't like the deal that distributor or financier was offering, and so they parted company. And that film was made independent of Jim and Phil. And but it did get made. And so Penny Allen borrowed Tom's equipment to make her first feature film. Gus Van Sant had been borrowing Tom's equipment to make his short films, and he used to hang out with us on Courier once in a while. He'd come and hang out at the studio, occasionally come with us to shoots and just hang out and watch a shoot. He found some of the locations for us and came out there, and so we all knew Gus pretty well, and this is all before he got famous, or even before he made Malinoche. And so he made Malinoche right after Courier, when all that equipment was available, and then the rest is history for Gus.
Right.
And he just loaned his equipment. Sometimes he loaned out so much equipment we didn't have enough of it to work on Courier. We didn't have enough lights, And so we wound up buying little scoop lights like you find in a hardware store that were pretty inaccurate and the wrong color temperature.
Right.
And we'd have to shoot wide open with the lens, full exposure, and push the development twice in the lab, which made the film extremely grainy. So the technical quality of the film is pretty weak.
Right. Although we did notice, like I said, I kind of re-listened to the episode, having really forgotten everything that we said about it, and I think we all noted that it wasn't a badly made movie technically in a lot of ways, but badly directed and put together, and all that stuff kind of ruined the technical ability that could have happened. And it sounds like you and the rest of the crew tried to cobble this nonsense together in many different ways.
Yeah, but both technically and aesthetically. There's 2 or 3 real key saviors of this film. Otherwise, the film wouldn't have been made. It would have been another Oregon kidnap caper that was just shelved. And by the way, for Kidnap Caper, even Monty Python's editor, who came all the way from England, how he made that connection, I don't know, but his name was Ray Millichope. He came over and tried to save Kidnap Caper, and even he couldn't do it, with all the talent he had.
A man whose job is to make the absurd could not make sense of the absurd that he was faced with.
Well, there's a difference between absurd and incomprehensible.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
So anyway, he went back to England, but I got a hold of him eventually and talked to him, and so that film was shelved. And everybody was kind of disappointed. He made VHS copies for the crew and stuff.
Do you have a copy?
All of them lost their copies eventually, and but Tom still had Ron Schmidt, who's one of the saviors of Courier, and I'll talk about him in a minute. Took a shot at trying to edit Kidnap Caper himself to see if he could save it. He kind of liked the challenge. He made it a little bit better, but it was still pretty incomprehensible for lack of a lot of bridging scenes. And so, but he had this work print, 60 millimeter work print that he used, and it had splices and dust and dirt and stuff on it. And since that was the only available copy of the film available, Tom had that transferred to a digital master at Technifilm. And so the Courier crew got copies of that, or the ones who wanted one. So I got a copy of that on VHS. And I think that copy of the work print of that edit of the film is the only one that exists now. And
as still film or on VHS?
On VHS.
Okay, so the film stock probably doesn't exist anymore.
I know it doesn't.
Okay.
When Tom...
So there's no 4K restoration of Courier of Death in our future.
That's not going to happen. When Tom eventually moved out of that studio, he simply just threw away all those elements for all his films.
Man.
Wow.
Yeah, they just got taught. And production photos, publicity photos, just everything that was, scripts, notes and stuff.
Wow.
The only thing that got saved was the stuff I saved and took to my house, like the music elements and the scripts and
yeah, you have in front of us your notes from making the film neatly compiled in a binder.
Yeah, I have my brown binder here, and this was my Bible during the making of the film, because all of us did everything on that film. I even made a list of all the different things I did on it, and there's actually 36 different tasks or things that I did on the film. Everything from a production coordinator and cleaning the camera gate every day and recharging batteries to occasionally directing, second unit scenes. A lot of people took turns directing second unit scenes, which is about half the film. And the guy I started to mention who really saved the film was Ron Schmidt. And he was the head editor, and he was effectively the director, the de facto director, and he will never admit to it because the film is kind of misanthropic against women, and that's the exact opposite of Ron's gentle, sweet personality. So when anyone says, "I think you might have directed some scenes," he goes, "No, I don't treat women like that. I don't want no."
Yeah.
And so, but I directed a few scenes where there's just nobody else to figure it out, and so did Dwight Lake, so did John Schmier. So on the DVD version that I'm trying to restore from a VHS tape,
right,
which is a challenge in and of itself.
Yes.
I'm going to revise the credits and give everybody a associate director credits.
Oh, there you go. That's a good
or,
idea.
Or sequence director or something. You know?
Right, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Something that won't upset any of the union crafts down in L.A.
Right.
So,
well, I wanted to play, I think I might have solved my audio issue here. So I wanted to play a little bit of the music, which is something that we haven't talked about yet. Another thing that we mentioned in our podcast is that our favorite thing about this was the music.
Yeah.
So I wanted to play a little bit here of that music. And no, that wasn't the problem.
Do you have a favorite?
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
can you still hear me?
So that's a little sample of the music, not from Stranger Things,
You're
but
right.
that is your music from Courier of Death,
Yes.
which could almost be a carbon copy. So all of this, it's been interesting to see how things are looping around and people are going back to this synth 80s stuff that you were in the thick of.
Well, in the early 70s, I saved up and bought a Mini Moog synthesizer, and there was very few people in Portland who had one. And suddenly, a lot of people were interested in hiring someone who had one of those to make like logos and jingles, and it was the latest really cool sound.
Yeah.
You know, and synth tunes had been coming out for a few years, and the Minotaur by Dick Hyman was a big instrumental hit in 1967, and so local radio stations, I started hooking up with them, and they would hire me to make little logos and jingles and news blips and just anything. And word got out to other stations. I wound up working for stations in Seattle and San Francisco and L.A. and even one in Alaska, and Dallas, Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, and made friends with a lot of these program directors and music directors at these radio stations. Most of them were Gene Autry's Golden West chain of stations.
Oh, funny.
Yeah, and KEX was the station here in
Oh,
Portland.
sure.
Oh.
And the program director was Victor Ives. And one of the top DJs besides Victor was Jim Hollister. And the two of them hosted a monster movie host show on KATU, Channel 2 television on Saturday nights called Sinister Cinema.
Ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, which they used to slate as Sinister Enema. And one day the slate got broadcast.
Oh, no.
And people called in saying, "That's great, you ought to change it to that." Anyway, I wound up working on that too, doing teleprompters and research and stuff like that. I got to know Victor and Jim. And so I had that circle of friends going on. And so I kind of semi-made a living along with other regular day jobs and survived doing those little synthesizer things. And I just composed a lot of my own little tunes on that too. I got a hold of a stereo and then a quadraphonic tape deck, and I was able to sort of do like George Martin did with the Beatles, and I'd record a few tracks and then bounce it to another one and then add three more and bounce it to that and eventually have a multi-track thing. And so I saved all these little tunes and things I did. And so I'd gotten pretty good at that by the time I got to Courier. And so I used that synthesizer plus a couple other synthesizers I borrowed from friends. And in a period of 2 weeks, came up with all this music as fast and frantically as I could after I got done doing all the other stuff on Courier that I was doing. And at the same time, I'm working on like 1,000 sound effects and room ambiances and stuff that you can't hear at all on the VHS copy. All this professional stuff that I learned how to do and applied to Courier is invisible or inaudible on the film because
that's a shame.
The VHS copies weren't even hi-fi stereo.
Yeah.
So you lost all the high frequency response.
Which is crazy. I found a copy of that at the Goodwill outlet bins just out of the blue. It just showed up in there, and I was like, it was like the holy grail. I was like, are you kidding me? This beautiful, pristine copy of Courier of Death.
Was that before or after we saw it?
It was after we saw it. I'm pretty sure.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was very exciting.
How much did Goodwill sold you for that?
Well, they at the Goodwill outlet bins they charge by the pound, and usually VHS tapes are about $1 still. So it's not any cheaper than the regular Goodwill, but the selection is much better.
The way Courier turned out, that's about the right price. Anyway, but due to Ron Schmidt, what we would do is wait for Tom. Tom Shaw took a big long nap every afternoon, after lunch. And so that's when we would go out and shoot all these bridging scenes with Ron or one of us directing to bridge two other scenes that Tom had come up with that made no sense to each other. So Ron would figure out a bridging sequence, write some script, and then we'd go out and shoot that. And then finally, this scene would make a little bit of sense and evolve into the next scene, and you knew why people were doing something. And so the film was pieced together like that, so at least there's a comprehensible story in it. It's no great masterpiece of storytelling. It's really just kind of like a remake of Charles Bronson's Death Wish.
Yeah.
You know, which Tom had seen and he was influenced by.
Okay.
You know, so.
So the people who were actors in the film, were they mostly friends, or are they were tryouts, or?
Well, they were friends, but they were all local actors doing
Sure.
local live theater.
Okay.
And Tom hired them and paid most of them, I think, for to appear in the film. And they were professional actors, and they were talented. And some weren't actors, but they learned how to act
Sure.
on this film. And Ron Schmidt was really good at directing them and getting a good performance out of the non-actors. For example, beautiful Barbara Garrison, I think that was her name the last time, who plays the blonde in the film. Her name is Barbara Niven now, and she's got a professional modeling studio or something in another town. Wasn't an actress. She was a model. But she wanted to be in the film, and she really looked great. The distributor says, hire beautiful people. You know, your lead actor
Yeah.
should be working out and have some muscle on him,
yeah.
and your women should be good-looking women.
Yeah.
And so Tom did. And all the women in the film were really good-looking. And there was a lot of women working on the crew, too. Like on the Courier publicity poster, where Joey Johnson, as J.D. Blackman, is holding the dead body of his wife. The actress who played his wife was not available the day we shot that poster. So the gal who played Annie in the film was the dead body. But she was also the assistant cinematographer, and she did a whole lot of other functions on the film. And
Brian is holding up the cover of the Courier of Death soundtrack, which is amazing, and it matches your Scary Stories shirt.
Oh, funny.
And I want that as a shirt. That image on the front of Courier of Death, the Courier of Death soundtrack.
That would
is
be great.
Super nicely packaged. And I listened to. I drove this morning. I was in Eastern Washington, and it was about a 3.5 hour trip back. And long story short, my brother and sister-in-law and my 4 nieces who have lived in this town close for the last 25 years, they're moving away. And so it was like this big emotional thing. And then it started raining, and it never rains in Eastern Washington. And so I get on the road, I'm just like going through all these emotions, and I just put on this soundtrack. And it was so neat and surreal, just like driving through the middle of nowhere in Eastern Washington, and it's raining, and it's like I'm all emotionally fraught. It was really fun way to experience that. But yeah, the album is great and available, I believe, at CD Baby, isn't it?
it's at CD Baby. There's some copies on Amazon and eBay floating around, and I have a few copies for sale if anybody can find me. And I don't have any websites or anything, but I do have an active email address. And
Yes, well, and you're featured prominently in the Amazon review section for Courier of Death.
Okay,
Which
so there
is,
you go.
you give a lot of good background information in that review, I remember.
And I think I put my email address at the time in there. And at the time
you did correct it.
Yeah, I did correct it.
You did
yeah.
correct it, yes,
Okay,
because
so
you
that's-
came back and said that you had a new email address.
okay,
I do
so
remember that.
so that corrected one is still my email address.
Okay,
so you
great.
can get a hold of me.
Yeah, great.
You know, if you
Well,
wanna buy a
and
copy.
there is not just a fan base for this movie in this room. It was featured, I don't know what year, but David Walker, bringing him once again, but did a screening with this and Fatal Revenge at some point.
At the Hollywood Theater.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yes, I was there.
Okay. Oh, nice. So you were able to be involved with that. Now, what is it like? Was there? So when you guys finished kind of cobbling this experience and footage together, is Tom still kind of not leading the charge, but like, is he saying, okay, it's finished now? Was there a premiere for this? Like, how did this all end?
Well, see, Tom just wanted to make money off this thing. He
Sure.
was anxious for it to just be done so he
Okay.
could make his deal and sell it. And the problem was the film wasn't done. And Ron Schmidt kept saying, "No, we need this sequence. We need that sequence. This doesn't make any sense here."
Well, and people weren't available to come back to do their
that was
their
another
ADR.
that was another thing, because a lot of people who were working for free or who were underpaid weren't always available.
Right.
And one actor who played the kidnapper in the film, John Benneth, he didn't like Tom Shaw, he decided, and so he decided to not only screw over Tom Shaw, but he invariably screwed over the entire crew by refusing to appear for his final key scene, the climax of the film. And so now we had to shut down production for a couple of months, and Tom and Ron got their heads together and rewrote about half the film and introduced a new character named Carver. And we found this great actor who was also a great crew member named Mel Fletcher. And it was his daughter who appears as a little girl at the very end of the film.
Yeah.
The family.
Yeah. And he effectively saved the film. Not only was he a good actor, but he knew a lot of technical stuff, and he was able to get a lot of technical things done and help out with the dubbing of the film. And he found actors to dub the voices. He found another actor to do John Benneth's voice who sounded like him.
Yeah.
And he found, Tom Shaw himself plays the pilot in the film, but Tom hated his voice, and so he wanted that dubbed too. So we found an actor to come in and dub his voice, who was real good too.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of good acting talent in Portland and Oregon.
Oh, yeah.
There was then and there is now. It's same thing with the music in Portland. The amount of talent in Portland is just stunning.
Yeah.
And we had no trouble finding talented people to work on Courier. It was just Tom, kind of sabotaging his own film all the time.
Right.
And we had to put up with it because he's the one, he owns the studio, he owns all the equipment, and he's the one who's going to slap his name on it as writer, producer, director, because that's what he always wanted to do. And so if we wanted to get this movie done and maybe get paid by a few points or something like that, whatever contracts we signed, we had to get the film done and to a point where it had a comprehensible story so that a distributor would want to make a deal. And so Tom would always be saying, "Oh yeah, that's it, it's done." And no, it's not. We'd have another week would go by. We'd schedule some more pickup shots, and so this went on for the last couple of months. Then Tom did find a distributor, brand new little company formed down in L.A. called Cinetel, run by two attractive people, Lisa Hansen and I can't think of the other guy's name right now. Anyway. So they came up and met Tom, and they signed a distribution deal as production agents. And what a production agent is they will take a little local film, and they'll take possession of it, and they'll pay the filmmaker X amount of money. And then they will turn around and sell the film to each different country around the world. And by the way, this film was not made for theaters. None of Tom Shaw's films were made for theaters. These were all made for video only. So Courier, Kidnap Keeper was supposed to be in theaters, but that didn't work out. But Courier was definitely intended to be for VHS video, and a film he made later on, one more, called Take No Prisoners, which the crew called Take No Paycheck.
Was that one never finished?
That was finished, and that's available on DVD too. Take No Prisoners, and you can find it on Amazon.
I imagine we have that on our list.
Were you at all involved in that movie?
No, I wasn't, but Ron Schmidt was. And there's a local actor named Jim Jameson, who was actually a professional actor who belonged to the Screen Actors Guild down in L.A., who moved up to Portland, and he's in all the films, And there's a few other key people who were in all the films, and their names escape me unless I start opening my notes here.
But this movie did find a fan base, like you said. We're holding the soundtrack, which is just beautifully packaged, I think. And so tell us about the cult status of this around the world.
Yeah. So by the end of 1984, my work on the film was done, and I moved on and got other work. But the production agents wanted additional pickup scenes, so there was another 6 months before the film was finished to their satisfaction. And there was some gore in the film they wanted cut out because this is going to be on VHS and kids could rent this thing. So Tom Shaw had to pull back on some of the misanthropic stuff he had in the film. And but he finally got it to their satisfaction, so they signed the deal. Later on in a TV interview during the making of his next film, he stated on camera that it cost him $60,000 to make Courier. and that he sold it for $250,000 to these distributors. So he made a profit. And I was supposed to get 12% of that, but that never happened. That's a whole nother story. And so I just went on my way, my merry way. So fast forward a couple decades, and I'm suddenly contacted by this guy in Scotland named Matthew Aldworth. He's in Glasgow, Scotland, and he and his collection of, I don't know, maybe about a dozen friends had found their copy of Courier, and they would get drunk, I guess, on Saturday nights and watch Courier and verbally make fun of it, just like a Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Yeah.
And it became kind of like their film, their thing that they did over and over and over again that kind of bonded them together. And Matthew was in charge of all this. Maybe he was the one who owned the film, the copy of the film. So Matthew finally found me and contacted me, and so we started sending emails back and forth, and we started talking about him putting out a soundtrack. He wanted to start a record company called Courier of Death Records.
It's amazing.
It's very specific.
Which kind of made me nervous because rap and hip hop, especially gangster rap and stuff, was happening a lot.
Right.
Then.
Didn't want to confuse the audience with your synth track.
Well, Courier of Death. You just look at the front or the name of the record company. It sounds like it's going to be a rap company.
Right.
But anyway, so he formed the company. I wanted to call it just COD Records, and so he put out this CD soundtrack, and I still had all my tapes, and so I restored them and made digital masters and sent it to him, and so he made this CD. After I left, there was another quote composer unquote named Dan Snodgrass, who was hired to do a couple little fill bridging pieces of music that these new scenes needed. And I wasn't involved in that. But he had lost all his masters. And so even though I got a hold of him, didn't have his masters anymore. And Matthew Aldworth wanted to include those on the CD too. So I got the sole credit for it. And so he's put this out, and it's available. And he and I have just continued talking back and forth over the years and the decades. And it's kind of amazing is that the Courier and Tom Shaw or me or the soundtrack has an actual fan club in Scotland.
Yeah,
of all
that's
places.
crazy.
And it's, with the internet making these kind of connections possible, it just goes to show how people of like minds can find each other.
Well, and I feel like
over
this
great
is
distances.
this is the type of movie that's just waiting to be discovered by the audience that I know will really like it, which is out there strongly, and it's just like trying to flag them down and give this to them as the gift that it is.
I mean, our hands are tied with this show in terms of the breadth of movies that we can watch because they have to be filmed in Portland. But I feel like with this one, we actually did find something worth sharing outside of this Portland film community.
It definitely has its Mystery Science Theater 3000 kitsch.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I contacted Mystery Science Theater 3000 when they were on the Comedy Channel.
Yeah.
And I said, I got a film for you. And I said, how much you pay? $5,000, they said. Okay, well, it'd be nice to make $5,000.
Sure.
But Tom was still alive then. He still owned the rights to the film then.
Oh.
And so I went to Tom and said, hey, you want to make $2,500 for doing absolutely nothing?
Yeah.
And so I explained it to him, and I showed him a little bit of a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode. I said, these guys will pay you $2,500 to do this to your Courier film. But, Tom didn't want his masterpiece being, belittled like that, So he turned it down so I couldn't get my half.
Did he think with his projects that he was creating something good, or did he know he's just getting product out? Because that makes it sound like I will sell out the integrity of my art.
Well, what Tom said when we were actually all done and the final VHS copies arrived for us to have, and we watched it, Tom said, well, it ain't as good as I wanted it to be, but it's pretty good. So it's okay.
That should be the box quote.
Yeah. It ain't as good. Yeah.
Ain't as good as I wanted it.
It ain't as good as I wanted it
And
to be,
just-
but it's kind of sort of pretty good.
To get an idea, we did play this in our other show, but an example of, which is a shame they didn't use his voice in the movie, because here is Tom Shaw's voice.
So good.
He's
Yeah.
at the beginning of the soundtrack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
response is the Courier. He thought he could be taken. He killed his best friend.
Anyway, so he's got a great voice in that little trailer, which is also on the soundtrack.
Yeah,
so
we made about 3 or 4 trailers for Courier, and I wanted to take my shot at making a trailer and doing some editing too. After I got a hold of some editing equipment at Portland Cable Access, and so I talked Tom into recording those lines and made my own little soundtrack.
Yeah, that's great.
And that trailer never got shown or released.
And it always bugged me because all the times I've known about that is that he says the Courier, but never the Courier of Death. Which
Probably
makes
because
sense
it
it wasn't
yeah.
named that.
It hadn't been changed yet. And I love the way at the end he goes, the Courier.
Yeah,
you know.
He's got like what they said, the Jabba the Hutt voice.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, we called him Jabba the Hutt behind his back. You know, so John Schmear came up with that. Cinematographer John Schmear.
I have a question. Tom Shaw, he was actually he played the pilot in the movie, but he was actually a pilot too, and he really flew the plane.
That airplane in the movie is his plane, and he had it in storage at Evergreen Airport.
Just looked so dangerous. We had hypothesized that it was shot from a helicopter and then sped up just because it was so much vertical movement, and it was so unlike a flight path of an airplane, because there's one point where it just nosedives like from the top of Multnomah Falls like onto I-84 and then just cuts, and I was like, did they crash? It looked terrifying, but he rigged a Bolex up to the wing of the plane apparently.
Yeah, he rigged up a Bolex camera.
Which I found an almost new Bolex camera at the bins, by the way.
Yeah.
But it was heavier than crap, and I'm like, I can't afford this right now.
Yeah. I own Will Vinton's Bolex camera that shot Close Mondays. I bought that from him when he switched to a 35 millimeter.
Wow.
So I still have that. And I shot animation on that of my own. Tom flew this little Piper plane, I think it was. It's called a Piper. And he had the camera mounted on one wing and a counterweight on the other wing, and there was a cable going into the cockpit. And you just push a button and the film would roll on the camera, and you push it again, it would stop rolling. And it was a spring-loaded camera, so you could only shoot, like 30 seconds or a minute or something like that, footage.
Yeah.
Then you'd have to land, wind it up again, and go up again, But usually a minute was enough footage.
Yeah.
But he did that several times. Ron Schmidt went with him, and he loved to do this little trick on his plane where he would pretend to have a heart attack and go into a dive.
Nice.
And scare the crap out of the guy
Classic.
riding with him. Then he'd recover at the last minute, and the guy riding with him was,
Yeah. Well, that's certainly what it looked like in the film, which is why we thought it was a helicopter.
So I'm guessing that's what he did for that one shot.
Yeah.
I heard about this story from Ron Schmidt early on, so I refused to go up.
Yeah, well, considering how much he apparently drank all the time.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
At one point, I had to record the sound of the propeller on his airplane. And I needed him to have it at one speed and then step on the accelerator so it would go up to another speed so I could put that on the soundtrack when the plane is taking off. And I reversed that sound for when he was landing. Well, when you step on the accelerator, I'm standing in front of the plane, maybe about, 3 feet beyond the propeller to get a nice clean sound, nice loud clean sound. So when he steps on the accelerator, the plane starts moving toward me while I instinctively move back. But Ron Schmidt is sitting in the plane, and he goes, "Oh God, we're going to cut up."
He's going to Raiders of the Lost Ark you into the next world.
But I didn't get cut up. I'm okay, and I got my good propeller sound. So
nice.
Yeah. So,
Nice.
but that's what sound guys do. They go out in the field and they record all these sound effects.
Oh, yeah.
And I did all the sound effects on that film, except there were other people helping me out too. The gal who played Annie, for example, we bought a watermelon, brought it to my recording studio in the basement of my house, and we recorded stabbing the watermelon to simulate Nancy stabbing the bad guys who had been torturing her.
Right, wow.
Which you can't hear anymore on the VHS tape. All this subtle stuff was done.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about listening to your stories, like I said earlier this week, we went over and talked with you for about an hour or so, is that the names that suddenly appear in your story, your stories about, and then I bought Will Vinton's camera, and you had all these stories, George Lucas, and then you showed us pictures of you with the Death Star model for Star Wars. And there is a story that you've hinted at in your email that I'm very interested in, and that involves Madonna and Body of Evidence.
Okay. Well, I would try to do anything that was involved in the film industry in Portland. And during the 80s, there was a lot of like L.A. union shoots coming up making movies for cable channels and stuff, the USA Network in particular. And Madonna came up making her movie Body of Evidence in 1986, I think it was.
93.
93? Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I mean, what?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm getting my years wrong. I'm getting old now.
What Todd is not telling you is that he is one of the world's largest Madonna fans.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And the formation of this podcast had to do with Halloween Town and Body of Evidence. And we're like, I bet you there's at least 10 movies that have been filmed in Portland besides those two. And then we stumbled into all of this.
Well, back in those days, I was pretty slim and trim, and I'd been working out in gyms for quite a while, and I was kind of toned up pretty good. I was no Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I kind of looked like a Olympic swimmer or something like that. And so I looked pretty good, and so I signed up to be an extra in that film. So I'm standing around, and although the film had a union director, it was really Madonna controlling everything. She was just a total control freak. And she, in order to be in the film, in her contract, she had approval of everything, every little detail. And so she picked me to be in this restaurant scene, okay? And extras are supposed to bring a couple pairs of pants, a couple pairs of shirts, but she didn't like any of my clothes. So she authorized me to get a couple $100 and go to Nordstrom's and buy this particular kind of pants, a particular kind of knit style and brand and color. And so during the lunch break, I went there, bought the pants, brought them back, handed them to the assistant director, who handed them to someone higher up, and then handed them to Madonna. She inspects the pants inside and out, makes sure it's the right label and the little tag on it and everything. And she approves the pants, and she checks off her approval. She's approved this pants, so the pants were given to me, and I go in the dressing room, I put on those pants, and then I'm in the restaurant crowd, and I have yet to find myself. Maybe I'm on the cutting room floor. I don't know. But at the end of the day, I got to keep the pants and all the change from buying it.
Nice.
All right, and the pants only cost about $30.
Wow.
So I got paid by the extra company and that money, but since she was right in my pants, I can now safely say, truthfully say, Madonna has been in my pants.
That's pretty great. Micromanaging an extra's pants.
Yeah, can you believe that? And she was just...
That's pretty on brand for Madonna, actually.
Yeah. And I saw the movie, and it was okay, and they made Portland look really good,
Yeah, so we've yet to visit or revisit, if you're me, that film for this podcast yet, but it is definitely in our future. So,
Tom made this final movie of his, Take No Prisoners, and he attempted to get funding for a whole bunch of other films after that, but he just couldn't get funding. And he shot a lot of test sequences and things like that, and wrote scripts and things. And he spent about 10 years just not getting anything accomplished after that. But I had this interview of him with this financial information on tape, and I took it to his place, and I played him the tape. And I said, "Okay, Tom, I know how much Courier costs. I know how much you made. It's right out of your own lips. My contract says I get 12% of the net returns. That comes to about $22,000. Where's my money?" "Well, I don't got it. You don't got it. It got spent on the other movie." He would.
And then he faked a heart attack. And
No, he didn't do that. But he was a master at talking his way out of tight situations. His partner in the porno stores got sent to jail for cocaine trafficking and served 5 years in hard time or something. He got out. Tom had used Dan Cosette's half of the money from the porno stores to make Courier. And Cosette got out shortly after that, came and confronted Tom. But I don't know. And so they split company. And what they did is they split the porno stores between the two of them. So Tom had some and Dan had some. And that's how they worked that out. So he did the same thing with me when I come confronting him. "Where's my money?"
Got a solo.
So I said, and I knew he was going to do that. So I said, I got an idea, Tom. Here's how we can be even Steven on that. How about, the Courier's all played out. And Kidnap Caper was never released, and Brats on the Mountain was just a short film. How about you sign over all the rights to those films to me, and we'll call it even? And Tom says, okay, all right, write up a contract, and I'll sign it. So I wrote up a one-page contract and came back the next day, and he signed it. And I said, I own the rights to Brats on the Mountain, Kidnap Caper, and the Courier. But the only copy I had was my little non-hi-fi stereo VHS copy because he'd thrown away all the elements already, you know. And Joey Johnson got some of the elements, but he got in some kind of fight with a girlfriend, and so she threw away all the elements on him. And so there was just no decent quality copies of anything of Courier. So now I'm trying to restore the film to release on DVD, create a stereo soundtrack, and also create an alternative parody soundtrack. It's going to be the first film with its own parody soundtrack. That's awesome. And I showed a section of that to you guys here, which we can't broadcast for technical reasons, unfortunately. But anyway, I'll post it on YouTube so that people can find
There
it.
you go.
Yeah. Well, and it's also nice to finally see whose copyright I'm violating by putting Courier of Death on the Portland at the Movies channel.
Yeah.
But that only has 24 views.
Yeah.
So
Now, see, here's something else I'm concerned about too. Matthew Aldworth brought up this potential problem. Is I never saw the contract he signed with the distributors of the film, the production agents. So I think Ron mumbled something that they had the rights to it for 7 years, and then rights reverted back to Tom. In which case, I'm fine. But if that's not true and they still own the rights, then I might not actually be able to release it unless I make a deal with them.
Right.
So, you know, I'll have to, Paul Hertberg is the guy, I remembered his name. I'll have to contact him and see if he even remembers the film. They use that as their flagship film to build their company.
Oh, wow.
And be able to produce 35 millimeter quality films for the Sci-Fi Channel, and they released a lot of their own films to video. And you'll see the Cinetel logo a lot on a lot of, lower budget films. But the technical quality of their films has gone up, and the filmmaking, the stories and stuff have gotten pretty good over the years.
Right.
So they're still in business, as I understand it. And so I'll try and contact with them and see if I can find out what their contract says and maybe get a copy of it if I can.
They can YouTube flag me, and that will be the easiest way to find them.
And then one day you'll find DVD copies of Courier of Death at the bins.
There you go.
Yeah, for $1.
Those are $2.19 each.
Yeah.
They charge separately for DVDs.
Actually, my version now, if I can release it, can be on Blu-ray now.
Oh, there you go.
And then maybe streaming or something. You know,
and this will be one of the special features.
Yeah.
Our interview with the composer.
I think and I've been working on this film off and on for 10 years or so, and it costs quite a bit of money to do this. So, and my cash flow is limited.
Right.
So it's very on again, off again kind of thing, and then I get hired to work on other projects, which takes time away from it. So it's a very kind of back burner thing that I get to every once in a while.
Yeah.
I found Jim Jameson. I had him record an audio track for me, and pretended that JD was listening to his phone machine, and I had an old cassette phone machine from that same era. And so I borrowed a gun from a gun collector friend and laid it by the phone machine, and you see this hand with a black leather jacket come in, turn on the machine, and there's this phone message from the colonel telling JD who has kidnapped Nancy. Because how did JD find out? Well, okay, the colonel told him on this phone machine.
So Jim Jameson was the colonel?
Yeah, Jim Jameson played the colonel.
Okay.
And did a real good job, by the way. And he's in all of Tom Shaw's films. And so he lives way out in Hillsborough. It took me about 6 months to find him. He's a Buddhist now. And so I found him, and he's an extremely nice guy, still, like he was when we worked on Courier. And so he recorded this little soundtrack for me gratis, and I gave him a copy of Courier because he'd never seen it or didn't have it.
Wow.
Okay, so that's our little barter deal. And I think I gave him a copy of Take No Prisoner, too. And this is a new scene that I've actually created to insert into Courier. And so he finds out where Nancy is, and then it cuts to the scene in Courier where JD is, packing himself up with all his weapons and stuff. Then he goes on a hunt for all these people who are involved in the kidnapping, the murder of his wife, and the kidnapping of his secretary. And that kidnapping of the secretary, I don't know whether you can run that or not, that was actually shot in Tom Shaw's studio, that scene, that whole sequence. JD enters in through the back door of the little studio that Tom built.
Right.
And JD walks down the main aisle, and you briefly see the lobby, and he glances into Tom Shaw's
I feel like we said
office.
I feel like we when we talked about that on the show that we thought that was Tom Shaw's studio, but that it looked too clean to be his studio. So maybe we were wrong about that.
Well, you know, what some of us were also on that was janitors, just trying
I
to
was
keep the
gonna
place
say,
clean.
it didn't look gross enough for what I would
yeah.
picture his studio being like.
Yeah. Well, it was actually pretty clean because, you know, we weren't shooting porno films anymore.
Right, that's true.
Although there was awful lot of women coming in and out of there, and there was a lot of rather short relationships between the crew and these women showing up.
Oh, the 80s.
Yeah, and also between the women members of the crew and male members of the crew. There was, you know, that happened too. And I sort of had my fun as well. So that was one of the perks of working on that film, even if you weren't paid.
Of Go-Go's 80s Portland.
Yeah. There was a gal named Connie. Nobody knew her last name. Who would come in and make coffee every morning, and she had been in the porno films. Yeah, and so she was a professional, and I'm going to give her a credit at the end of Courier and Kidnap Caper.
As the coffee maker.
The coffee lady.
Well, it's been fantastic being able to sit down and talk to you about this stuff and just getting some more context about Portland filmmaking and these names that kind of pop up every time we talk about them. So I wanted to thank you for coming in.
I've got two questions left.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was unresolved from our first viewing of the film was the location of that shootout scene at the beginning of the film with all those small houses.
Okay.
Oh, right.
All right.
Was that Alpenrose?
No, that is down in Estacada. There's a big park down there, and there used to be a big logging Oktoberfest, and there was these big pieces of logs, and all those little huts and things existed for that, and there'd be this big logging competition where, you know, they would climb trees or what loggers did.
Interesting.
And a lot of that stuff was still in that park when we shot that first shootout sequence, and we went there twice to get that because we needed pickup shots later, so we went there a second time. And I've been there since then, and all that stuff is gone now, but the park is still there.
Oh, interesting.
So that was shot all down in Estacada. And then near Sandy, you know, that little bridge that goes over the Sandy River, right near Troutdale?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's a road just on the other side that leads to Estacada. Well, some of the car chases were shot on that road. Okay. And like one shot of the car chase would be on that road, and then another shot of the car chase would be up and, you know, on the way up to Rocky Butte. And there was a scene we shot on the top of Rocky Butte, too.
With the Colonel.
Yeah, with the Colonel. And that scene had to be shot 4 times for technical reasons. And then the entire soundtrack had to be dubbed because the synchronization mechanism on either the camera or the Niagara tape recorder hardly ever worked both at the same time. One of them was always malfunctioning. And we all nagged Tom, or I nagged Tom, like, please get these things fixed because we're going to be a month editing this, just the scratch track on this film to get it back in sync so we can use that as a guide to dub the film. And the more stuff we shoot, the more work we're going to have to do without this equipment working. And the camera didn't have a blimp on it to muffle the sound, so it sounded like a lawnmower all the time, all throughout these scenes. And so Tom finally fixed the synchronization mechanism on both things. And there was one time when we were just outside his studio filming a pickup shot. And right next door to his studio was a dentist office. And we were out there shooting. And while we were shooting, a station wagon pulled up with about 6 people in it. And I guess a couple of kids were going to go in to see the dentist, okay? And we were shooting a shot, and there was a lot of chatter going on among Tom and the small crew, and Tom got upset, and he said, well, who's directing this film anyway? And so I tried to get a laugh out of everybody. I said, well, counting the people in the station wagon, maybe about 18. Tom was not amused, and I had set the tape recorder on the ground because it's really heavy, and I had the microphone and everything all ready to go, and he came over and he kicked the recording machine and broke the sync mechanism again. So, and so that was the end of that. So we had to redub the entire film. The only piece of original sound I got was when JD is crying with his dead wife. I insisted that the camera back up so I could get in close, and he would use a longer lens to get in close so that I could get decent sound on that one because Joey Johnson acted his heart out for that scene. A magnificent performance. He was an excellent actor. He still is. And he was also great to work with. He was always up and cheery, and when we were all depressed and bogged down and stuff, he'd come on with big smiles and things. So he was great to work with.
That's cool.
He lives down in Salem now, and I think he works for the state of Oregon.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And by the way, I also arranged in 2009. We had the 25th anniversary of when we all worked on the film. I arranged 3 different reunion parties. And so Joey came to one of those. And
fun.
Yeah, those were a lot of fun, too.
Sure.
And so it was great to see all these
It's
guys.
like a weird summer camp bonding thing to survive a production like this.
Yeah, when you work on a film, you really wind up bonding with
sure.
the crew, And
Well, and especially when it sounds like it's chaotic and ridiculous and all of that. You're all in it together.
But it was also fun, too. We a lot of us weren't being paid, and so we just decided we're going to have fun doing this, too. And so we kind of tried to bring that attitude to it when we weren't depressed or upset about how the film was turning out. And like I say, Ron Schmidt really saved that film. Mel Fletcher saved that film. Gerald Howard, who is now a model animator. He worked in clay and foam rubber. He worked for Will Vinton. He was an animation director for ABC TV for a TV series called Bump in the Night, a children's Saturday morning series. He's an excellent animator. But back then, he had hardly worked in the film industry at all, and he came and helped us out with sound editing toward the film. He did sound editing on that.
Wow.
And I recommended him to be hired at Will Vinton's, and Vinton hired him. And he definitely proved himself there, and so he got his animation career started that way. And he's still he went down to L.A. for a while, and he came back to Portland. And I think the last I heard, he was profiled on Oregon Outbeat on OPB. And the last I saw, he was making a film about that giant Paul Bunyan statue that's in North Portland.
Yeah.
And it comes to life and starts walking down the street
Oh,
or
fun.
something.
Huh.
So I think he may be still working on that, and I don't know any details about it.
That's cool.
Yeah, so he's like the other guy besides Gus Van Sant who's really launched a professional career and has had the talent to pull it off, who emerged out of Tom Shaw's dungeon of filmmakers.
Well, before we wrap up here tonight, Dan, is there anything else that you brought with you that you wanted to share with us or show us?
Well, mostly stories, but I don't know. I have some visual stuff here, but I don't know whether it's possible. There, you have a shot of Tom Shaw on your computer that I sent you.
I do, but I'm not broadcasting anything other than sound from my computer.
Oh, okay. Is there any?
But yeah, I'll use that as one of the stills for this episode and for the when I put it up on YouTube as well.
Yeah,
So.
Tom Shaw was hired to pose for a Money magazine.
Yeah, it's a great picture.
Yeah, a local one. Yeah, and so they posed him at this billboard or blackboard.
He looks like a coach there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's what Tom Shaw looked like, old crusty. I mean, he's just the very definition of the word crusty with a C. Everybody who ever worked for him, who was friends or not, remembers his gravelly voice and his personality, and the fact that he was generous with all the local filmmakers. You got to give him credit for that.
Yeah.
And his talent as a director is questionable, but he was a part of the film scene, and there was an awful lot of interconnectedness between local filmmakers because of Tom Shaw being one of the fulcrum points for Portland's filmmaking, along with the Northwest Film and Video Center, and there's still a fulcrum, and the Center for the Moving Image when it existed at Portland State University. Tom Taylor there later worked at Portland Cable Access and formed a production company for seniors, and he ran that for several years before he passed on, and then Andreas Dynam passed on too. So both of them are gone. But Bill Foster and the gang over at the Northwest Film and Video Center are still thriving. And if you want to take some pretty good film classes, that's where you want to go. So
that's great. Well, thank you once again for coming in here and telling us your stories and helping keep this part of Portland's history alive and remembered. So thank you for that.
I've become the archivist of Tom Shaw. I've been consciously collecting everything I could about Tom Shaw and his movies And I'm going to be eventually turning all this stuff over to the Oregon Historical Society and maybe the Multnomah County Library.
Right.
So that not only the memory of Tom Shaw, but all these other people who worked for him and with him and knew him gets preserved. I'm a bit of a historian and preservationist myself.
Yes,
so
that was I believe our word for it on the way home was not preservation.
Collector.
Well, there was a specific word, a catalog.
Catalog,
I believe is what we.
That too, yeah. See, I've worked for libraries. I worked for the.
That makes perfect sense. And it all clicks together.
Yeah, the audiovisual department at PSU, I worked there for 5 years, and that's part of the library system at PSU. And so, I've got that kind of mind where, the cataloging and filing and being able to retrieve information.
Yeah, well.
Every job I've had ever since or before was making some kind of order out of chaos. I worked for a bank creating a record system in their vault. I worked for the post office for a while, sorting mail, getting the right mail to the right place, So every job I've ever done had something to do with making order out of chaos. And that's what I did at Tom Shaw's place, too.
That's a perfect description of probably working with Tom Shaw. So thank you. Yes, thank you once again for all of that. Yeah. I'll do a quick wrap-up here. Head to funemploymentradio.com, who is a proud sponsor of this show. Their 10-year anniversary is coming up in November, so that's great. They do a podcast 5 days a week. You can hear me and Mark on the Mark and Toddcast, so you can go over there, do a little science and humor podcast most every week that we're not doing this. And Brian, what is the Unipiper up to right now?
We are preparing for the Weird Portland Gala. Very exciting. So check out if you want to get involved in the weird scene in Portland and stay up to date on what is going on and be a part of that action. You can buy yourself a ticket to the Weird Portland Gala on November 7th at weirdportlandunited.org/gala.
Perfect. Thank you guys for all listening. I'm going to take you out with a little bit more of your music, Dan. This one called The Chase, which we listened to early. So we will see you guys later.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you
for coming.
I'm going to skip. We already played that part. All right.